Welcome, everyone. Thank you for doing this, Oisan, and welcome. I hope you're okay in KL. I want to begin after what Sarah said, giving just a context of how and why we asked Oisan to speak for us on this topic. It actually gives me no pleasure to see a crisis in Malaysia, but it has been brewing. We at the SIIA have been looking at our region in the lens of the pandemic in terms of the social, political, and economic stresses it's been put onto every single country, including Singapore. And we've sadly seen that this second and third waves, the Delta variant in particular, have increased not only the cases, but the political pressures. And we see problems emerging in our region, which weren't there so obviously there last year when the cases were much lower. We will be releasing a report about the state of ASEAN. Within that context, I think Malaysia, our neighbor, is very important. While not the largest member of ASEAN, it is actually one of the most open for trade, has been economically successful, and would, in many measurements, be a middle income country. But when we talked about Malaysia last, we started to see schisms, infighting, and this has sadly continued. Dr. O. Aisan has been our fellow, and before that, he has worked in a number of think tanks in Singapore and in Malaysia. And previously, a fairly long time ago now, held a position in the Malaysian government. And he is well poised to really guide us through some of this thinking. One more note from me. I think many in this call, like me, have cousins, uncles, relatives in Malaysia. We hear and oftentimes are saddened by what we hear of their daily tumult and their anxieties. I sympathize with this, but in a way, I rather approach this slightly more academically or professionally. Ask Oisan to, impartially as possible, share us his reading about the politics and economic impacts Malaysia is going through right now. Oisan, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Simon, and also Seraphim. I guess I will start by a very brief update on the pandemic. Malaysia's coronavirus pandemic remains very, very serious with over 20,000 new infection cases every single day. And typically, a day would not pass without seeing around 200 or sometimes 300 deaths. And as Simon mentioned just now, sometimes some of our close friends and relatives also succumbing to the coronavirus. Malaysia's vaccination rate remains one of the highest in the world, with over 500,000 people being vaccinated every single day. But sadly, that appears to be not quite sufficient in terms of handling this so-called new Delta variant, which is bringing the, I don't know whether it's the third or the fourth, or some even call it the fifth wave of massive infections, at least in Malaysia. Some would blame this sort of outbreak primarily on the government of Malaysia, which has instigated a series of what we call policy flip-flops. For example, imposing the very stringent lockdowns on the one hand, but also opening up a lot of economic sectors for apparently not quite scientific reasons to be able to operate. So there seems to be sort of the government, there's a sense that the government is losing its plot in terms of balancing so-called life and livelihoods between these two, whether one is more important than the other. Socio-economic difficulties remain very, very serious. The so-called white flags movement and also the black flags movement. The white flags movements are basically people who are really running out of their wits in terms of how to survive in this pandemic. There are a lot of them are day wages, people who will survive on daily wages, but unfortunately, due to the lockdowns of their particular sectors, they could not work, and therefore their hand to mouth sort of livelihood is greatly affected. There are also those who fall into the 40% lowest income brackets, who previously might have been in the middle income brackets. And Malaysians typically are a very shy lot, but the situation is so desperate that people indeed would hoist or raise white flags in order to get help. Now, this white flag movement sort of evolved into the so-called black flag movement. That has a little bit of political undertone, but is actually, at least at this moment, driven mainly by a group of, shall we say, socially and politically conscious young people across racial lines, across professional lines, to try to number one, instigate some sort of social protest against what they perceive as the inefficient policy implementations of the government. Now, let us now switch to the meat of the presentation, namely the politics. I think it is very important at the very onset to sort of frame this latest series of political struggles as that primarily among the Malay elites, among the Malay political elites of the country. You have, for example, UMNO, with its simmering dissatisfaction of being not the number one but the number two in the government. I think UMNO, if it is in opposition as it was from 2018 to 2020, then it will do its best to try to undermine the incumbent government of the day at that time, Pakatan Harapan. Then when it came to power after the so-called Sheraton move early last year, I think because the Prime Minister, Mr. Muhyiddin's Bersatu Party has fewer parliamentary seats than UMNO. So UMNO more or less view Muhyiddin as sort of a transitional or interim figure, and with the hope that in due time, and such due course would not be a very long one, perhaps a few months, he would very willingly hand over both the premiership and thereby the leadership of the ruling coalition to UMNO, which rightfully thought and still thinks that the leadership of the ruling coalition is very rightfully its own. So that's why you see all these months, UMNO has been trying, what I was trying to do was basically, and there are various metaphors for this. You could call them rocking the tree in order for whatever is on top of the tree to fall down, so that they could climb up to the tree to be the top honcho on the particular tree. Or you could also say they are rocking the boat. I mean, if we think of Muhyiddin as a captain of the boat, I think the UMNO passengers are sort of rocking the boat, such that at some point, if Muhyiddin is unable to sort of steer the boat and so on, then Muhyiddin would, and Muhyiddin's crew would relegate themselves to be the passengers, and then the UMNO passengers will now become the new crew, hopefully with the UMNO captain. I think it's important to frame it in this way, because I don't think UMNO is really intent upon destroying the ruling coalition. That's why UMNO has been very careful with its wording, that, for example, it is not supporting Muhyiddin, withdrawing support from Muhyiddin, but it did not say we want to totally disband this ruling coalition. What UMNO hope is the ruling coalition will still be intact, with people even such as Muhyiddin himself really calling it a day, but still remain at, for example, the backbench, or being made some sort of senior advisor to cabinets and so on. Then UMNO's people would zoom in and assume the leadership of the ruling coalition, and therefore the premiership. Now, notice so far I have not mentioned a single UMNO leader's name. Huh? Why? Because, well, indeed, there is another round of, shall we say, mini power struggles within UMNO itself to see, for example, if UMNO was indeed is indeed successful in rocking the boat and thereby replacing Muhyiddin and so on, who then among the UMNO crew would become the new captain? Huh? I think there's another round of sort of power struggle within UMNO. It is tempting, I think, to view the power struggle within UMNO as primarily between those who are currently in charge of the party, people such as Zahid Hamidi and Najib and so on, with their, shall we politely say, court concerns or legal concerns on the one hand, and they are roughly known as the so-called court cluster, and on the other hand, there's a so-called cabinet clusters. Those UMNO members with, members of parliament with cabinet appointments and deputy ministers and government-linked companies, chairpersons, and so on, led by, for example, the newly appointed Deputy Prime Minister Ismail Sabri. It is tempting to assume that these are the two primary factions because they are largely true. I would have to admit that. But of course, there are various nuances, right? I think perhaps a more apt description would be that it's everybody for himself within UMNO. All these senior leaders of UMNO, they would in name align themselves to one or both. Now, it's very important to note that they are aligning themselves sometimes to one or even both of these factions, but hopefully at the end of the day, they could maneuver themselves such that they would be in a leadership position, and should UMNO succeeds in unseating Muhyiddin, then they will be, either one of them will become the new captain. That's why in addition to Zahid, in addition to Ismail Sabri, there are figures popping up such as Tunku Razali Hamza, the former the finance minister, who is trying to position himself as a possible caretaker or interim prime minister candidate. And then there are, of course, other figures such as Hishamuddin, such as Khairi, and perhaps various others more minor figures. Each are trying to jostle for the party's leadership, and thereby, if the party unseats Muhyiddin, becoming the new prime minister. So, and in the process, they might align themselves to the cabinet cluster or to the so-called court clusters and so on. So again, I think it's important to note that they still want to keep the boat intact and sailing through these choppy waters. But Captain Muhyiddin proved himself to be, of course, more than an interim or transitional captain. He has been extremely tenacious and, shall we say, resourceful in terms of prolonging his rule or his hold on power over the past months. For example, in theory, when a new prime minister is appointed, such as Muhyiddin was appointed last year, he should expeditiously submit himself to a parliamentary confidence motion, right? Muhyiddin, it's hardly imaginable. He has been able to delay that confidence motion until now, more than a year and a half into his administration, and he is, of course, promising such motion of confidence in next month's parliamentary session at the repeated urging of both the people as well as the usually reticent Malaysian king. And now, but I think it is even doubtful whether Muhyiddin would indeed introduce such a motion of confidence next month, because his track record over the last 1.5 years, frankly speaking, was less than stellar one in terms of upholding parliamentary democracy and so on. He has been delaying parliamentary sittings, delaying confidence motions, even cancelling parliament sittings at the instigation of the pandemic and so on, promising to introduce certain bills into parliament, but instead not doing that and trying to short circuit the constitutional process and so on. For example, from now till next parliamentary sitting in September, we don't know how high the pandemic numbers would surge. Could that be used by Muhyiddin to once again delay parliamentary sitting? Even if there is a parliamentary sitting in September, many are wondering what sort of, shall we say, quasi-constitutional or constitutionally bending tricks he might pull out again to, for example, not introduce such a confidence motion. Now, even if the confidence motion is introduced, there's no guarantee that it would be expeditiously voted upon. And if it is voted upon and Muhyiddin did not succeed or does not succeed in such a motion, there's even no guarantee he would willingly step down per constitutional requirements. So that's why a lot of people are in doubt because of, well, his not so good political track records over the last 1.5 years. The Malaysian king is a constitutional monarch, and so far what the king has been doing has been still within the constitutional bounds. As Muhyiddin stretches and bends the constitutional bounds, the king also sort of skirt with his role under both the written constitution as well as the unwritten Westminster's constitutional conventions. For example, for almost the first time in Malaysian history, instead of Muhyiddin advising the king, as is usually in the constitutional monarchy, the king exercises Westminster's rights to be of advice to the government, to advise Muhyiddin in return, saying, hey, you should hold parliament session as soon as possible. But still, that is within constitutional conventions. Some observers looking at the situation and the de facto constitutional crisis is calling upon the king to refer, for example, to the 2008 Perak constitutional crisis, whereby the Perak Sultan dismissed a sitting chief minister of the state, even though there was no confidence motion in the state assembly, because it was clear to the Sultan that the chief minister has lost his majority. Myself, I have called for the king to refer to also the 1975 Australian constitutional crisis, whereby the Governor General of the day dismissed similarly recalcitrant and constitutional bending prime minister, even though it was not clear also whether the prime minister still commands a parliamentary majority. And later on, Dr. Mahathir also echoed this call for reference to the 1975 Australian constitutional crisis. You observe that, for example, during this whole latest round of political drama, the opposition is sort of sitting at the ringside, right? Anwar Ibrahim became less ambitious, or at least it would appear to me, did not repeatedly call for himself being made the prime minister. He actually kept a very low-key profile. Similarly, the largest party in parliament with the most seats, DAP, also did not make a noise at all during this latest round of political drama. And that, I think, is precisely because it's mainly a political struggle between UMNO and Bersatu for political dominance within the ruling coalition. They do not actually intend either side upon bringing the opposition to form, for example, new ruling coalition, even though, of course, anything is possible nowadays after Sheraton move. Civil society, I think, will continue to try to be active, both in voicing out their political dissatisfaction, but more importantly, I think civil society is taking a more prominent role in terms of helping or assisting the socio-economic needs of those deprived, socio-economically deprived, whom I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation. I think looking forward, this sort of political instability will not cease until UMNO gets to be the number one political gets to be in a position of unquestioned political leadership in the country. Because let's say if there's a change of leadership and UMNO is still not made the prime minister, somebody from UMNO is still not made the prime minister, I think UMNO will continue to rock the boat. If lo and behold, the opposition is coming back as a PH government, UMNO also will try its best to undermine the PH as it did from 2018 to 2020. Meanwhile, Malaysian economy is more or less on a sort of autopilot mode because, I think we are in need of more clearer and more consistent industrial and investment policy, and this is frankly not forthcoming. So I think I will stop my presentation here and then welcome any question.
Thank you, Oisan. There are a number of questions coming into the Q&A already, and I invite you participants ready to just type it in. And I'll do my best to put this to Oisan and to share it with the others. Oisan, I think let's take the first question that starts sort of within the framework you talked about. First, I was astounded that your presentation was very thorough, but didn't mention for the first 10 minutes Anwar. And when you mentioned Mahathir, it's only because he agreed with you about the 1975 Australian case. Let's get to them, those two perennials of Malaysian politics in a while. The question I'm looking at is really about the actual split within the sort of Malay elite you mentioned. Basically, first, the question is very particular. Is there a familial connection between the king and the current PM? There have been talk about this before. And does it play into the significant events you talked about now? I mean, how much basically will the Sultan really push for motion confidence or dare to push again if there is no such motion put before Parliament? And connected to that, a bigger one is, while this is about Malay political elites, political power, the question is about corruption and patronage. When you say every man for himself, you mean every man for his wallet, is it?
Yeah. Okay. I think since perhaps a month ago, Muhyiddin has sort of put himself on a collision course with the monarchy, in the sense that when the king publicly sort of strongly admonished the government of the day, Muhyiddin did not, as would usually be the case, put up some nice words to try to at least placate it. But instead, he came back with a very legalistic response saying the king essentially should mind his business as a constitutional monarch and take whatever advice me as prime minister and my cabinet would render. I don't know of any familial sort of relations between the king and Muhyiddin, but the king has acted more or less on popular sentiments these few months. For example, in urging Muhyiddin to open parliament as soon as possible. And now, as we are speaking now, there are various reports. Sometimes it's very difficult to differentiate between fake and not so fake news, right? There are various news reports by by quite prominent news sites, saying the king has urged Muhyiddin to bring forward the motion of confidence, and Muhyiddin is trying his best to try to resist that, and so on. So in that sense, I think I don't think there's any love lost nowadays between Muhyiddin and the king, number one. Number two, yeah, you mentioned patronage and corruptions and so on. I think that would continue whether it is still under the Muhyiddin administration or if there's a new UMNO administration, because, unfortunately, especially UMNO, it has sort of evolved over the years into the machinery for distributing various, shall we say, political and other sort of largesse to its factions, to its leaders, even to its grassroots. So, yeah, a major point of contention between UMNO and Bersatu is, for example, control over various government resources, such as political appointees, not only at the federal level, but even sometimes at the local levels. How come the UMNO branch chairman is not made a certain, let's say, city councillors? How come it's the Bersatu leader? So you would not see sort of correlation between a change of government and perhaps a betterment in terms of patronage and corruption and so on. Yeah.
So in that sense, if I could follow up your closing point that you won't see stability for Malaysia unless UMNO is somehow reinstalled. If they're in opposition, they continue to try to undermine. If they are the junior partner, they always try to grab more resources. So in this sense, even though you might see some stability, you don't see any prospect for actual reform. So the stability would be kind of a return to the past.
Yeah, because the less than 2 years of PH administration, of Pakatan Harapan administration, was an attempt at reform. But there were apparently two really diverging, shall we say, points of view. Number one, there were those Pakatan Harapan activists who thought the reforms were not thorough or advanced enough. They should have more reforms to rid the corruptions and so on. On the other hand, of course, you have this, shall we say, the more traditional rear guards who would like to hold on to their vested interests, who would think that these reforms are too radicals and so on. And at the end of the day, as the Sheraton move proved, these rear guards won. Yeah.
Let me move on then to the inevitable two names of Malaysian politics, Dr. Mahathir and Anwar Ibrahim. Our feed question and answer has many questions about, is Dr. Mahathir finally finished? Is there any possibility that he would be somehow the interim prime minister again? Would you like to address that? And the flip side of that is, well, the longest waiting number two, besides Prince Charles, Dr. Anwar Ibrahim, get to be number one in this, emerging from this intra-Malay fighting, basically outside of the Perkataan and the UMNO battle, PBM and other Malays leaders.
As I said, in recent months, after Sheraton move, anything is possible. Would there be a return of Mahathir? I'm not excluding that possibility, but it will appear that at the moment, the present very amorphous group of, shall we say, Malay power elites, they are not in favor of either Dr. Mahathir coming back even as interim prime minister, or Anwar Ibrahim ever ascending to the premiership. That's why you have all these other names, shall we say, harmless names, such as Tengku Razali being pop up. Because the Tengku Razali administration, I think in a lot of people's view, would indeed be the interim one. He was sort of hold the fort over for the next few months and so on. They don't want somebody who is as strong-willed as Dr. Mahathir, because Muhyiddin was a surprise for them, right? And then Anwar with his sort of well, allegedly liberal thinking and so on would not be acceptable to these very amorphous groups of power that be here.
In other words, if you're looking for a compromise prime minister, neither of these are very compromising figures. They will really try to take charge in their own way, and therefore they're not acceptable to the power brokers. They might not find that middle ground.
Yeah, indeed. Well, of course, if the two of them work together, yeah, they will have an outright majority. They would, then one of them will become prime minister, but they cannot work together.
Yeah. Let me turn that into the DAP question. As you pointed out, and it's correct, the DAP, though it is the largest party, single party in Parliament, has actually been very quiet. Of course, partly is they're going through their own transition. Term limits and some cases against Lim Guan Eng will lead to his retirement. I hear they're lining up basically likely candidate, though I'm not sure it's been officially announced. We therefore see the DAP for the moment quite reserved. And one of the questions relates, of course, to that racial tension. We've gone from the most multiracial cabinet to the most, as you said, intra-Malay fighting cabinet. Neither have done actually particularly well in the 2 years plus or year plus they've been in charge. And so I think the DP is sitting on the sidelines at the moment. Once they finish their own internal decision making, will that continue? There are some rumors emerging about them also putting up a Malay candidate in front, not Anwar, but trying to find somebody from East Malaysia, or finding a way to work with what you call the cabinet cluster, picking someone like Sabri or Hishamuddin to form a sort of coalition with in a different way. Are those science fiction?
No, I think what you mentioned, all possible is just that the right alignment of stars and moons and sun would have to be in place for that to happen. I'm not totally excluding them. I think we have to notice that DAP is number one, a very patient party. They've been in the position for more than half a century before coming to power. And number two, a very flexible parties in terms of aligning themselves with whichever power that be. And number three, I think it's also very important to note that among all the political parties ranging from UMNO to Bersatu, PKR, and so on, DAP appears to have the most, shall we say, coherent and cogent leadership succession plan in the party. If Guan Eng is gone, like tomorrow, there would be new leaders stepping up, and they do have certain national statures, people such as Anthony Locke and so on. Yeah, the same unfortunately could not be said of any other party. If Muhyiddin is no longer Bersatu leader, who would step up to replace Muhyiddin, for example, UMNO or Anwar, right? But I think DAP is playing a safe game of cards now, because they know that there is still a lot of resentment from the, shall we say, Malay power elites as to DAP having having come to power, number one, and having held quite important positions, including finance and so on. So they don't want to sort of unduly muddle the game, but they would like to let it see whether, shall we say, the slightly more liberal factions within this Malay elites would come to power and thereby would work with DAP. Yeah, I think they're playing a very safe game of cards here.
Yeah. And in this sense, if I could turn from the race question and the wider society, try to connect the two, this white flag and this black flag, and the anger that top level is every household in Malaysia to be let down so badly. In many cases, some of the governments have not been able to stop the pandemic, but some people accuse the Malaysian leadership of actually, in a way, starting the pandemic, the second and third waves, because of the Sabah elections, and then on. So, what scenarios are you thinking about that this power struggle won't just be contained within the Malay elite, or even with the Malay elite and the opposition, but really spill over into a broader dimension socially. Nearby, we see in Thailand, massive protests restarting despite the pandemic, despite a lot of policing by the private government. Might such scenario unfortunately play out in Malaysia?
Well, I think number one, it is important to note that, and this is almost like a Schadenfreude, as they say in German, like some sort of luck or joy out of something which is not so good. You would see the majority of these white flag and black flag movements are from the Malay community, the majority Malay community. So if from the non-Malay communities, then the power that we could always sort of cast it in a racial framework or racial angle, right? And thereby very adroitly dismiss such movements as being non-Malay challenge to Malay power. But the fact that those who are raising the white flags are mostly Malays, and those leading the black flag protests are also mostly Malays, is actually well, politically it's a point of light, or it's a light of hope, right? In the sense that hopefully this younger generation could indeed bring forward a slightly more progressive political outlook for the country if they were to succeed. But it's a big if there. Now, Malaysia would perhaps not see the kind of, shall we say, very widespread street protests as in Thailand, because it's simply not in the Malaysian traditions to do so. You saw, for example, let's say 10 years ago, there were this, 5 years ago, there were this massive so-called Bersih yellow shirt protests and so on, but they lasted like at most 2 days. Usually they lasted only a few hours, and they are quite disciplined. They would not like spill out into weeks or even months. It's just not the Malaysian sort of culture to do so. But this sort of desperate call for help is very real, and that's why I said there are various civil society groups and individuals trying their best to try to help out with this suffering people here.
Okay, so you believe that racial tensions are there, but they will be kept under control. There won't be a spill out into a wider community. In fact, because many of the underprivileged at the moment, the white flags are for Malay, poor Malays, their hope remains in some progressive Malay leadership.
Yeah.
Now, if I could turn to that, you mentioned Kari Jamaluddin once. And of course, there is another young minister, Syed Safiq, who was in the cabinet with the interim Mahathir administration. And then now I think he's being charged for corruption. Beyond with these two and others, what is the possibility of a generational change, moving from the Mahathir Anwar really down in age and outlook to be Malay-led but progressive?
Well, there is a new generation of UMNO leaders and ministers popping up, but I think they still have to somehow make themselves more prominently known. I mean, I also befriended a few of them recently. They sound very reasonable with no overly racialistic tones and so on. The problem is they are still not prominent, so they need some time to rise to prominence. That's why I say DAP has been very successful in doing that, sort of nurturing, I think, not only a second generation, but a third generation of future leaders for the party here.
Okay. And then you mentioned DAP once as a very quiet party, progressive, and sorry, patient, progressive. Can I ask you about another party, which is still quite considerable, and we've not mentioned it once, and it's sitting on the sidelines, PAS. What is their likelihood to play? What kind of role will they play in all this mangle going on?
Now, PAS is like DAP, a very patient party. Huh? And PAS would like to, just like UMNO, keep the present Malay-dominated ruling coalition. But you must give it to PAS that they are not very eager in terms of grabbing all the cabinet positions and so on. What PAS would like to see is whether it's UMNO in charge or whether it's Bersatu in charge, the social policy of this sort of government would mostly be in accordance with PAS liking, namely to making it more religiously inspired and religiously oriented. Huh? So as long as you can satisfy PAS, shall we say, more religious and social agenda, then the PAS could be your sort of very good ally. You see, PAS sort of moved from an alliance with UMNO to Bersatu, right? Because after joining the government, they saw that Bersatu is more amenable to their requests. For example, after, if I remember correctly, October of this year, you could not sell alcohol in the convenience stores in KL. That is something which PAS would very much like, and it was made possible under this administration. So when PAS saw that, they gradually moved closer to Bersatu and away from UMNO. But in order to entice PAS back to your fold, you would have to just, it's actually, put it very bluntly, not an expensive sort of alliance. You don't need to give them extra cabinet posts. You just need to sort of align your social policy more with them. Yeah.
Okay. The questions are really leading to almost like a bookie's take on it. All kinds of names, Shafi Abdal, Tunku Razali, again, Dr. Mahathir, all popping up. But I want to, I'm happy if you want to take a punt on them, or even Najib returning somehow. I'd like to see your thoughts on the pathway for that happening. But I think you've said already, in a way, anything can happen, because that's the way these backroom trades are being done. So I'm happy if you want to share with you any insights on the ground. But I would like to, in a way, encourage the last few seconds, few minutes to be on a broader frame. What is the time frame, do you think? I mean, basically, if I asked you in 6 months, would there be still the same situation, still the same leadership, or would there be likely to be a change of some kind, or reaffirmation of leadership within 6 months? What's your sort of timeline, basically? And within that, what could go wrong? I mean, we are not at any stable point of the pandemic. The economy for many people, as you said, is really hand to mouth, not figuring out where help can come from. So while in a way your analogy of rocking the boat suggests that hopefully the sea is stable, calm, because if you're already rocking up and down the boat, it's bad enough. But if the sea is churning, and that it seems to be churning, and you're also rocking the boat, something seriously bad can happen. So in your last bout of remarks, Oisan, would you either pick horses like a bookie, or talk about these slightly longer term concerns?
Well, I think the king from now on would look forward, if there's a change of government, to appoint somebody with indeed a more sizable command of majority. That is why my good friend Shafi Abdal and so on, I frankly don't think it's very likely that he'll be appointed as a prime minister. Najib is, disclaimer, I was his political secretary, right? But I think he has to solve his legal concerns first before he is a serious candidate in the running, and the same thing goes for Zahid. Huh? Now, it is of course a race for time between sort of the political development of the country and the economic direction of the country, right? If somebody from UMNO is indeed made prime minister, and it is not a very controversial figure in UMNO, then we will have political, shall we say, stability, quote unquote, in as soon as let's say 1 month. But whether this person is capable of, for example, handling the pandemic and reviving the economy, I think that is really up to question. And that's why there's a lot of, again, I want to emphasize this self-help going on among both the commercial sectors as well as the civil society in Malaysia, because people seem to not pin their hope as much as before on the government of the day, regardless of who is in charge. Yeah.
Okay. Actually, we've got a few more minutes. I think we're supposed to end at 11, right?
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Sorry, I thought you would take longer on the last answer.
Okay.
No. Let me just double check. If I'm wrong, I think Sarah better tell me. But I think we're supposed to finish at 11.
Yes,
So,
we're supposed to finish at 11. We still have about 5 to 7 minutes.
Good. No, first of all, while I'm trying my best to read through the many questions and answer them, if there's anything that pops up to you, you want to reply to, please go ahead. If you can multitask and look on it. Maybe one question that emerges, especially since you're from Sabah, and is there any residue of UMNO deposit in Sabah, Sarawak now, in East Malaysia? And therefore, in a sense,
I think the political landscape in both Sarawak and Sabah are really very fragmented nowadays. You see that recently playing out in a sense that UMNO Sabah's leader, Bang Mokhtar, he declared that, I'm going to follow the federal UMNO's decision to withdraw my support from the Muhyiddin, but at the state level, I'm still going to work with Muhyiddin's party in still running the state government, right? So in a sense, that means he has a degree of autonomy within Sabah. In Sarawak, of course, everybody is anticipating the next state general election. And although I'm still quite sure that the current ruling coalition in Sarawak will be returned to power, I'm not so sure they will still command as many seats as they do currently, because I think they have a strong competition from a new party called the PSB party. There are various rumors as to who is actually sponsoring this party, including some said it could be the chief of state. I'm sorry, the head of state of Sarawak, the former chief minister. So that would sort of muddle the Sarawak political waters a little bit. So federal, who is in charge of the federal government, of course, would also have a bearing as to the formation of new governments in Sabah and Sarawak. Let's say it's no more Muhyiddin as prime minister. I think it is very likely that the Sabah state government, even though it might still be a coalition, but the UMNO gentleman or the UMNO state leader would then become the chief minister. I think it's distinctly likely. Yeah.
Thanks for reading that. One other question that comes up is not just civil society to address, but civil service. I think in a previous webinar about the situation in Malaysia, was it you or another speaker expressed a certain confidence that even if Muhyiddin's cabinet seemed a bit in disarray, the Director General for Health and the civil servants were stepping up to establish that competency and that management, which I think Malaysia's civil service has been one of the better ones in the region. What's happened with that? Do the civil servants who used to applaud when Dr. Mahathir came back, who tried to do their duty when Muhyiddin took over, have they continuing that fight, or are they kind of also being despondent and concerned?
Well, I think more broadly speaking, the Malaysian civil servants, they are still considered to be efficient and so on, and especially sort of holding the administration through all these choppy political waters over the past few months, right? But in particular, I think the reputation of this so-called Director General of Health has suffered quite a lot since, let's say, same time last year, huh? Because at that time, Malaysia's COVID cases are really low. Now, number one, it's really high. And number two, he has also been perceived to have politicized himself, for example, in support of some of Muhyiddin's not so popular policies. So I think nobody is holding him up as a hero as they did, let's say, last year. Yeah.
And so that, again, I think maybe come to the end comments or anything you want to say. But if I may ask you to respond to this, I mean, again, I want to emphasize, it doesn't make me happy to put forward this scenario. But what you're describing is an intense politicking of backroom politics, while in the society more generally, people can see the suffering. Is this tenable? Or is it like, Nero fiddling while Rome burns? Really, I put it jokingly, but it's quite a serious question. Because of course it would affect Singapore if Malaysia really went down a dark path. What would you say to the outsiders worrying about the ability to just keep this boat, this rocking boat, somehow stable, despite all the rising waves of COVID, etc.?
Well, Nero's fiddling leading to the, well, not leading, but during the big fire in Rome or something like that, I think it also has some sort of socio-economic undertones to it. Huh? I mean, Rome itself did not quite produce a lot of resources and so on. Malaysia is still very lucky in the sense that it has a lot of natural resources from oil palms, rubber, to oil and gas and so on. So that those productions will still go on and in a sense provide some revenues to the country. And another lucky thing is, of course, this country has always been, I think, as you mentioned at the onset, a very commercially driven one. Huh? And that means, yes, government could set a lot of policies and so on, but ultimately it's a businessman, it's a business persons who are, with their drive and the determination, who are trying to steer their business to more profitable ventures and thereby employing more people. There is, of course, as I again mentioned, now also some what I would call social entrepreneurs, people who are setting up startups, not only to get listed and so on, but also quite genuinely to help their local communities such that they could make them money themselves and the local community could at least get some help by being self-sufficient and self-sustaining. I think at least in the near future, I think these few groups of number one, very entrepreneurial, and number two, very social-minded civil society would sort of keep Malaysia, the Malaysian ship afloat while the politicians are sorting out their differences amidst their political struggles. Yeah.
Also, let me close off. Thank you very much for that insight. In a way, one of the key points I'm taking away is that at the moment, both the DAP, PAS, and the opposition are being patient and waiting. And so is Anwar and Dr. Mahathir. They're leaving it so-called to the Malay elites to have this discussion first. So in a sense, I take it, and I'm not sure you said it, but I take it to be that there is a kind of implicit recognition that we don't want everybody rocking the boat at the same time. It's enough if Bersatu and UMNO are contesting. And this is kind of a wisdom to it. The second thing I'll take away is that from a Singapore perspective, we always expect the government to be essential. And you're describing a society emerging very quickly that is much more understanding that we've got to take care of ourselves. The civil society has got to help the companies have got to continue doing business and do what they can, keep factories running if possible within the rules, or sometimes, whatever, to basically keep that boat afloat and moving forward. I hope that is the case. It doesn't help any of us in ASEAN, let alone Singapore, to see an unstable Malaysia. A number of the responses you have are very reassuring. And in that sense, I hope you're right.
Yeah.
Last word is yours.
Yeah. It's just, again, this is really the silver lining, namely, as you see people resorting to, in a sense, self-help. These sort of self-help efforts are really across religious and racial lines. It's really like Malaysians looking out for each other. It's quite amazing. I mean, it's, as I say, Schadenfreude or silver lining, that during these difficult times, instead of going at each other, Malaysians actually would come forward to try to sort of help each other, to shore up each other. That for me is something, yeah, quite reassuring. Yeah.
Thanks. I was hoping to come something positive out of all this, otherwise a mess. And I think you've given us at least that glimmer of a silver lining. One last comment before I thank Oisan. Oisan along the way has mentioned that he was in the cabinet secretary to executive secretary to Prime Minister Najib. I should clarify that this was pre-Jolo, very early. Because I mean, Najib Razak's name is inescapable in our Q&A, plus many other calculations of who really holds a lot of power still at UMNO. So I just wanted to clarify that if I could. Yeah.
Thank you for
Thank you very much, Oisan. Please take care of yourself personally in Malaysia. Of course, with the pandemic numbers so high, while I want you to go to the ground and listen to what's happening and all the back rooms you can get into, please be careful of your own health.
Thank you.
With that, allow me to thank you all for taking time to be with us.